2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Professor Jim Jost. Jim, haven't seen you in 3 weeks, so great
morning,
to
Mark.
see you.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Hey, you look the same as you did when I left you a couple of weeks ago.
I hope so.
That's a good start. Something that we do want to talk about this morning that has been canvassed a lot lately, it has come up in the news lately, is freedom of the press, with some of those high-profile investigations coming through, particularly from the AFP and the like.
Yes, Mark, it raises some serious issues about the role of the press in the wider community. But the big issue, we start from the first principle that a free press is an essential part of a working democracy. It's there to keep, not just simply to keep the public informed or to keep the public entertained, but it's also there as a means of keeping some checks and balances on those in power, in effect scrutinising those who exercise political power, both in the private sector but also from the Parliament, the Prime Minister and so forth. A free press, one that's able to report as freely as possible on the workings of decision makers and power, is absolutely essential to ensure that our democracy works effectively. Now, those are the sort of, should we say, the first principles, the basic principles. How things pan out in practice, of course, vary quite considerably. So in Australia, we have a range of press organisations, but a highly monopolised, shall we say, traditional press relationships and so on. The rise of social media has prompted a range of other sources of information, and it's also facilitated and made possible the dissemination of information in ways that weren't thinkable 30 or 40 years ago. It's also made it possible for those who witness something improper or untoward or possibly illegal on the part of decision makers and getting that information out into the public. These are the whistleblowers or the people who are willing to take the risk of prosecution for bringing information to public attention, which our leaders or decision makers shouldn't be behaving in the ways that they sometimes do, or organisations, for example, performing in ways that are contrary to their charter or contrary to their rules, and perhaps just behaving badly. So the problem for whistleblowers is that the level of protection is largely nominal, even when there are codes of conduct or particular protections in place. It almost invariably means that the whistleblower is the one who is held to be the problem, not the wrongdoers or the people who are doing the wrong thing by their charter or by their codes of conduct or by the law for that matter. The whistleblowers are the ones that become the targets and the focus. So it's very difficult in many respects for journalists to get that information out because if they do, they are liable to prosecution, and that's what's happening at present. As Mr Dutton, the Minister for Home Affairs, puts it, and he's quite right to put it like this, if they break the law, they face the consequences. That begs the question, however, of are the laws that are put around protecting particular bits of information, are they appropriate for what's available, and should there be some means by which the people who identify wrongdoing and make it known, should they be much better protected? And in particular journalists. Now the major newspapers at present are mounting a bit of a campaign to have journalists protected because a number of their journalists, or at least 2 journalists, were chased down by the Australian Federal Police and had their homes raided and so forth. Similarly, ABC officers and some of their journalists were subjected to searches and possible charges. The question, though, is not just simply protecting the journalists, but the issue should be about ensuring that information is made publicly available where it bears on the public interest and where it bears on the wrongdoings of those with power.
Well, when you think about it, Jim, it can be a little scary. I mean, when we've seen those raids, and they were very highly publicised, and it does put those in the middle that are trying to report on some of these things. It will put a lot of people on the back foot, because, to be honest, I don't know that I would like the Australian Federal Police knocking on my door and just going through my house. Nothing to hide, by the way, AFP people, if you're listening, but it's very daunting, and to a lot of people they would just say, look, I'm not going to touch these stories, I'm not going to get involved, even if they may see it as legitimate to do so. It's just all too hard.
That's the chilling effect, Mark, when those who report on various things are subjected to that sort of treatment. The history, if you like, or the trajectory over the past couple of decades has seen a gradual squeezing of news information, of news sources, and especially as new areas emerge, social media, WikiLeaks and all of that, poses different challenges to how we might regard freedom of the press. And maybe you need to rethink some of that. But the general principle of speaking truth to power, of holding our decision makers and our elected officials, including our appointed officials in the public service, for example, holding them to account to ensure that their decision making is as transparent as possible. Yes, there are occasions where full disclosure of what people are doing is not in the public interest because of various reasons, but too often decision makers hide behind a cloak of secrecy, or you don't need to know this. This is just
not for the
part
public domain,
part of
and
the
all that.
internal workings of our organisation. But where open government and transparent decision making is part of a democratic process and part of what we would like to see in a free democracy. The propensity of governments over the past couple of decades to squeeze news sources, to squeeze news organisations, various press organs, to have them toe a particular line or only report what might well be favourable, and to close out or freeze out those organisations who might report unfavourably. Those are the sorts of things that make a free press less viable. And I think it's reasonable to say that decision makers prefer a pliant press, prefer a press that doesn't hold them to account, whereas it's in the interests of the citizens of the country, of voters, to have a press that does ask the hard questions, the embarrassing questions. And I don't mean the trivial type questions, but the more serious ones that actually go below the surface and say, well, how did this come about? What are the issues here? And to actually bring those issues into the public domain so that people can make up their own minds about it.
All right, Jim, it is something that's not going away. Thank you very much for your thoughts on that this morning.
Yeah, my pleasure, Mark.
Our Professor of Politics, Jim Jose, right here at 2NURFM 103.7.